So when we talk about the way that a soybean plant grows throughout the season, a lot of this is going to be dependent on several different management decisions we make. One of those is what happens at planting. So we have pretty much around me as looking at 3 different row spacings and 2 different plant populations. A big question that we've gotten over recent years is, we found that a certain plant population works at a particular row spacing. How well does that translate to other row spacings? And that's kind of what we're trying to evaluate here. We have the traditional 30-inch rows that we would have maybe in a full season production system. We have 15-inch rows that you would kind of see blended between a full season and maybe a double crop. And then we have a 7.5-inch row spacing here that you would more likely see in a double crop scenario, although we do see this sometimes in full season. And then what we're looking at is a 90,000, which is where we found is our appropriate or our best case from an economic and agronomic blend plant population in one strip, and then we also have a strip of 120, so our old recommendation on what we would traditionally plant. And so with that 90,000 that we've evaluated on these 30-inch spacings, what we wanted to do is see how well this grows on both a 15-inch and a 7.5-inch. And a couple of things that we need to notice. Again, this is about talking about how a plant grows throughout the season. And one thing we do notice is that from a turn row or from a distance, these 30-inch spacings particularly look really good early in the season because of how much soybean we kind of plant in that singular row. Here we've kind of compacted all of our population into these 30-inch rows, so we have a whole lot more plants in a singular line than we do spread out around the area. We still see some good line formation and it still looks really nice from the turn row on those 15-inch. We are spread out a little bit. And then if you've ever seen a 7.5-inch from a turn row or off in the distance, you might see that we have maybe what looks like skippy population or not a great population. And that's just kind of these 2 different forms of competition we have, these interspecies competition. We have within row and between row competition. When we have these really wide row spacings, we have a much higher in row competition, meaning that the individual plants within the row, so the one to the north and the south, if you will, are competing much more with that singular plant than the ones from the east and the west. So we get a lot of competition within row, and so the more we can kind of space those out, the more we allow that plant to kind of grow out. But we do expect that soybean plant to kind of puff out to the side because that's where the free space is. Where we have 15-inch, you started to see still got a lot of in-row competition. We do see the plants kind of bulge out still a little bit, but you do get, especially later in the season, you do get that competition between rows because you have plants that are much closer. When we go to the 7.5, what we see is a lot more between row competition. So the individual rows east and west have a lot more competition, have a lot more impact than sometimes the north and south, the individual plants within row. And that's why we see that kind of that smattering of plants, or that what looks like a patchy stand or a skippy stand when we get 7.5s, because then we have plant spacing not only within the row but also between rows. So we still make up the same plant spacing we would get on a square foot area in these 30-inch rows, but it's kind of on a more circular basis to where we have some spacing within row and some spacing between row. So what does that actually do for our plants? Well, if we are planting earlier in the season and we have a longer vegetative period, so a much longer period for those plants to grow, we typically will see a shorter plant with the 7.5-inch, a much larger plant with the 15s and the 30s, because of that competition not only in row but between row here. And what we'll typically see is the 7.5 will kind of cover or lap rows quicker, but we will see that happen in all 3 row spacings pretty quickly early in the season. As we go later in the season, what we see is our vegetative period gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And so where we typically see that is the amount of growth that we can potentially get within these individual plants. So on a 30-inch spacing planted later in the season, so we're talking about June planted, maybe double crop after wheat, we will typically see these 30-inch spacings not lap the rows or not fully cover that space in between the rows because there is such a greater distance. 15-inch will start to lap those rows or cover those rows much easier. But the 7.5s, that's really where they shine. Is the whole intent is to cover that row as quickly as possible because we are getting less vegetative growth. We are doing that by just having those more tighter rows and smattering those plants in to where they get a good amount of space to grow. And what we typically will see is because of the lower growth we just traditionally get with these 7.5s, we capture those beds or we cover those rows. Even in the most latest of planting, we typically will do it here. And that's kind of what you've seen. So these have been in the ground not but a couple of weeks. And we are already seeing the 7.5s kind of cover that in between row spacing to where we are starting to shade out some of the weeds we typically see. And we are seeing less weed pressure, not zero weed pressure, but much less weed pressure with these 7.5s. Where on these 30-inch spacings, you see a lot of grass is starting to pop up. These will have to be controlled. We still have grass that probably will need to be controlled in the 7.5s, but it's going to be an easier task than what we will have in the 30-inch and even particularly in the 15-inch. So this is why a lot of growers like to move to this 7.5-inch the later we go. And so the question then goes, can we transition some of these seeding rates or the information we've gotten on seeding rates to these 7.5s? And that's what we're looking at here is, can we transition that 30-inch or 90,000 and 120,000, depending on your planting date, transitions well to these 7.5-inch spacings.